Welcome to Fight News Now Extra. I'm John Pollock with lots of news going on in mixed martial arts, including a landmark deal by the UFC that is going to change aspects of the business. Josh Koscheck gets a fight booked, and an update on Alan Belcher. Josh Koscheck will return to the octagon at UFC 184 on February the 28th in Los Angeles, and it will be against Jake Ellenberger. Initially, Koscheck was rumored to be fighting Neil Magny on that card, but instead it will be Ellenberger, with both welterweights losing their last 3 fights. Koscheck last fought at UFC 167 in November of last year, where he was stopped by Tyron Woodley. The UFC has announced a huge 6-year sponsorship deal with Reebok and the implementation of fighter uniforms. Fighters are going to be paid based on their rankings with a tiered system, as well as getting a cut of their individual fighter kits, which will be sold to retailers. Fighters will still be allowed outside sponsors, but can only wear the clothing from their fighter kit into the cage and throughout fight week, and will also see the elimination of sponsorship banners inside of the cage. And Alan Belcher provided an update when he appeared on the MMA Corner, stating that he is looking for a return to the octagon next summer and will likely be returning to the light heavyweight division. Belcher has not fought since April of 2013, where he lost to Michael Bisping at UFC 159, and has been with the organization since 2006. Here is John Ramdine and Robin Black. You guys are not in your uniforms. It's plaid now, everyone. We're all going to be wearing the same.
I didn't get the memo.
Well, it came out in a 6-year format just the other day with the UFC and Reebok. And this is something that we've been discussing for a long time. This has always been something that the UFC has been working towards. And the way this breaks down...
This was the big announcement, right?
This was going to be the big announcement from a couple of weeks ago. That was
the time is now.
Huge announcement.
The time is in a week or two.
The time's in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But this is going to be broken down into, you will be paid based on your ranking. Champions will get a set amount, and it's 1 through 5, 6 through 10,
based on the imaginary rankings.
Well, that's a big problem here. I think it's a massive conflict now. I wasn't interested in being part of these rankings to begin with. I think now that you have a direct correlation to what a fighter makes, that to me,
part of it.
You're really messing the lines. And I just, to each journalist, they have their own opinion. But for me, I would not want to be a part of that. I just think that's not really the role. It really just muddies the waters for me.
Of course.
At the expense of sounding like an arrogant prick, I actually might now do it. Before I wouldn't have done it because it was stupid. But now I might do it because it matters, and I'm actually a smart journalist, and most of these guys are idiots. So I'd rather me be doing it than most of these tomato cans.
The problem is it's going to be coupled with the tomato cans. So it really doesn't make a difference.
Will it? Because Dana White, to his credit, is at least acknowledging there's a lot of problems with these rankings, and we do have to weed out some of the people. And there are many credible journalists out there. I would be much happier if the Robin Blacks, the John Ramdines were doing this, as opposed to someone who might do a drive time show and he watches MMA every now and then, and his voice is the same as you who consume this 24/7.
Yeah, I get it. I still wouldn't want to be the guy that their money hinges on what I say and where I put them in the thing. I look at rankings completely different. I just look at it as because we looked at my recent rankings, and I have Hector Lombard lower than Kelvin Gastelum, and the reason why is because Gastelum has competed more times in 2014 than Hector Lombard. But it's like, well, what about the level of guys? Yeah, Kelvin Gastelum has a win over Jake Ellenberger, but we've seen that Jake Ellenberger maybe not as ranked high as Jake Shields, for example. But so there's so many intangibles.
You're making Pollock's point right now. You actually will give thought to all of that stuff. And even then, be uncertain of where somebody falls in because you care.
Is it that crazy an idea that we give this, and I am not imploring that we give more work to these two, but if Sean Shelby and Joe Silva, they are the rankings committee.
Yeah. And maybe you add 2 or 3 other executives in the company that have some important job connected to that.
We saw in the Ultimate Fighter, though. Yeah. We saw in the Ultimate Fighter they made up these rankings for the current season. And what did those rankings really tell us? They told us absolutely nothing. There were a bunch of numbers where they had the Randa ranked one of the last.
And she's won 2 fights since. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. There's a lot of stuff that will come out of this. It may end up looking really cool. There's a lot of good. When Reebok is your partner, they're thinking, oh, what does this mean for the UFC? Reebok now has a connection to the UFC and a reason to use all of their resources and everything from small things like their mailing list to large things like their reach to help push the sport. So that's really valuable. Some of the downside, I actually got out. I was managing fighters. I got out of the management business only a couple of weeks ago. Not connected to this. But then I thought about it after. I'm like, wait a second, you don't get 20% of any endorsements anymore. Like, so I got out at the right time. Also, you get tied up in all of the other analysis. It didn't make sense for me. But suddenly, every manager out there, this will be a good way for the UFC who don't like managers to kind of slowly discourage them from being involved.
But one thing, you got to look at the fighter's standpoint. And Nate Quarry was recently in the Underground, and he talked about, you know, when he was with the UFC and he signed his contract, he said, you know what? They said, you know, Nate, we cannot pay you this amount of money, but because of that, you can go out and get your sponsors. And then from there, it turned into you can get sponsors as long as we approve them. Yeah. And then you can go get sponsors as long as they don't conflict with our other sponsors.
And only ones that will pay us 50 grand for the right to sponsor.
Exactly. So it kept going and going and going.
I mean, sponsorship money for fighters, I mean, it's drastically gone down. And I think it is going to raise the floor. I think for your fighters, you're not going to see like a Matt Wyman now walk in with no sponsors. It at least helps them. I question, though, the top guys. Like Demetrius Johnson, he is synonymous now with Xbox. And now Xbox is not an approved sponsor. So is it going to hurt guys who did go out there were big names, and bring them down? That's kind of the balancing act here. But you would think on par, at least for that middle to bottom tier, they now don't have to worry about that headache. Am I going to go into a fight? At least I'm getting a baseline. It might not make me a millionaire, but it's something to supplement my income.
There's good and bad in all these things, but this is just representative of corporate America. This isn't one weird UFC thing. This is what's going on in big businesses across America and in the world.
All right. We've got lots more coming up this week. Lots of UFC 181 coverage, and Fight News Now Extra continues.